Hi, welcome to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm your host, Mark Grabe, and our guest today is Jerry Wright, author of the new book, and I'll hold up a copy here, The Insanity Trap, What Your MRP Consultant Won't Tell You. So Jerry Wright is an accomplished operations executive and a teaching professional with over 39 years of experience in the manufacturing and service sectors. His extensive career spans various industries, including aerospace, consumer goods, healthcare, medical devices, diagnostics, and industrial sectors. He's held leadership roles in engineering, operations, quality assurance, and operational excellence. And he is a master black belt and only the 7th person in the world, or at least 7th at the time, to receive the Lean Gold certification from the Joint Alliance of ASQ, AME, SME, and the Shingo Institute. So Jerry, thank you for being here today. How are you?
I'm so happy to be here, and it's a good day to be talking about Lean and MRP and all the other good stuff. So I'm very happy that I could join you today, Mark.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're here, and encourage everybody, look in the show notes for links to Jerry's website, leanwright.com. That's with like his last name, W-R-I-G-H-T, Lean Wright, and links to his book and more. So, you know, Jerry, before we talk about the book, I do love asking people their Lean origin story. It probably goes back a while, considering everything you've done in your career. What's your Lean origin story?
So interestingly enough, when I got involved with Lean was back with Kimberly Clark, but it wasn't called Lean. It was so long ago. It was before 1996 when they kind of coined the Lean term. We called it world-class manufacturing. And at the time, the book everyone was reading was either The Goal by Elihu Goldratt on Theory of Constraints or Richard Schoenberger's World-Class Manufacturing. And so we were talking about setup reduction and quick changeover. And, you know, we didn't call it 5S, we called it housekeeping and all those kind of things. But Kimberly Clark was one of those companies. I worked for them for about 10 years and had an amazing start on the scientific method, following theory of constraints and doing all that. So when people started talking about Lean and, you know, probably about mid 1990s, I'm like, wow, this sounds like stuff I already know. And then I kind of got a better feel of the one-piece flow and Kanban and things like that from 95 probably through 2005. So that was kind of where my Lean started, was really with Kimberly Clark. But to be fair, I'm a son of 2 OCD, Lean-oriented parents. And my dad was super organized. He labeled everything. Everything had a place and everything was in its place. We always cleaned up. It was, you know, a penny saved is a penny earned. So we were very lean-minded. And I didn't think of it that way. I'm just growing up as a kid, and my sister is cut from the same cloth. Incidentally, she has a green belt, and she's more or less, you know, just an office manager at a doctor's office. But she lives and breathes it. And we kind of grew up that way. So that's kind of my Lean origin story.
Yeah. So it sounds like a household with, you know, some organization, some discipline, some standards. Do you remember, you know, were your parents open to Kaizen opportunities or suggestions from the kids?
I think so, but I mean, they had a pretty strong expectation of, you know, you were going to make your bed, you were going to clean your room. I mean, neither one of my parents are in the military or were in the military. But I almost felt like that sometimes because it was not only my dad's organization, but my mom was just very, very neat and clean and organized and expect us to be the same way. So I think it was just how I grew up, and I didn't know any different. I don't know that they would ever have opened a Kaizen mindset up, but they really did say, hey, you know, if you think you can do it, do it. So they had a good empowerment, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, cool. So back, you know, in the 90s at Kimberly Clark, was that your first introduction to, you know, I don't know, the battle with MRP, or the as the book is titled, was that the first insanity trap of MRP that the company was caught in?
A bit, Mark, and not from that same perspective. Back then, Kimberly Clark was big into large warehouses, and they would fill them full of, you know, whether it was paper towels or Huggies diapers or Kleenex facial tissue. And the goal at Kimberly Clark was to be very efficient with running of the paper machines that were making the tissue. And so even if we didn't need the product, we would still make it. And that was a bit of the challenge you see with MRP today is we were making stuff, but we had, in the place I worked last for Kimberly Clark and for the longest was in Fullerton, California. The plant has since been closed, but it was the site where, if you've ever seen the green and white or the blue and white boxes of low lint wipers, Kim wipes or K-Dry, very popular in laboratories and clean environments. All of the Kim wipes in the entire world were made in that facility. And so we had pretty high volume and demand. Just to give you a rough idea, when we were making Kim wipes, the little square boxes that are the most common ones of the low lint wipers, we would make 8 boxes a second. So it was super high automation, super high, push into theory of constraints, efficiency. We tracked efficiency and throughput and scrap and first pass yield and all that. And we really worked to try to do quick changeovers. Our changeovers were a little bit like what Shingo experienced. They were like 8-hour changeovers, and we worked to get them down to like less than 30 minutes. So we had a lot of that good experience there. But yeah, Kimberly Clark was not where I really picked up on it as much. It was more moving on to companies after that. So in the late 1990s and through there that I just started seeing the ills and the pitfalls of making stuff, to be fair, to a guess. And said,
otherwise known as a forecast.
Yeah, a forecast. Yeah, we say estimate or forecast. It sounds so much better than guessed or wild ass guess, but that's how it goes. But when I got into AME through my folks that I work with at DJO Global, they were both big long-term AME folks, and they said, no, we got to do Kanban. I'm like, what's Kanban? Because I didn't know what he was talking about, and back in 1999, and he goes, "It's this," and I go, it seems to make sense, a 2-bin system and so forth. But I got more of the input into the challenges with MRP with DJO, and that was my first experience of the insanity trap. And the best way to put it, Mark, was, and I like to describe it, and I do describe it in the book in a little more detail, but let's give a short version of it. We got to production on Monday morning. They'd run the MRP, the forecast, over the weekend, and they printed it out on that big green bar printer, the white and green, the impact printer comes out, and they'd start going through the orders. And they'd, go through the page. Well, we don't have that. Oh, we can't make that. So what can we make? And they were, this green bar printer, I'm not kidding you, for the week schedule was about 2 inches thick. And there were only maybe 12 or 13 orders per page, but you can imagine how many pages. There's literally thousands of orders there. And after they got about 2 hours into it and realizing, they just say, well, let's just make what we can, and let's, and then we'll wait and rerun the MRP later. And so then they would wait and rerun the MRP again the following weekend, and on Monday, the same thing would start over again. Tuesday, we're off. We're just trying to scramble to get parts in and figure out what to make. And this insanity trap kept running and running. And I'm like going, I was in the engineering and other side of it. I wasn't in operations yet. And I kept going, why do you guys do it that way? That seems really challenging. Yeah, well, we got to make sure we update the MRP and the forecast. They had 9 people running production control, forecast, expediting, doing all this kind of stuff. And yet every week it was the same nightmare over and over. And one of the guys, he's unfortunately since passed away, Bill Holbrook, was working for us at the time, and he said, we just need to unplug the MRP. And everybody went,
not run it better. But
what?
Yeah.
The people's brains exploding. Wait a minute, we just installed this, it was this business planning and control system software. We paid for this, we got to use it. And so he goes, no, it's not working. I can tell you guys, we need to pull the plug. And Bill was one of those guys who was one of the original people that founded the Association for Manufacturing Excellence. And some people know this, not everybody does. AME broke away from APIX at the time. API, I guess it was Association of Planning and Inventory Control Society or something like that. APIX was all about MRP and running MRP, and AME's like, no, we need to do Kanban, zero inventories, pull systems, so more like Toyota and things like that. And Bill basically went to a board meeting with the C-suite and said, yeah, we're going to unplug MRP. And Bill was reporting to the COO at the time. The COO kind of goes, Bill, you weren't supposed to tell him. We were just going to do it, but you weren't supposed to tell him. And then they did. Everybody had a cow. It was just like chaos. But the good news is Bill had talked to the folks in my team, and we started setting up we started with a 3 Kanban bin system. So we were like 99.7% on track of having everything we needed. And we realized, man, that was a lot of inventory. So we eventually, in about a year, we brought back to just 2 bins because that was more than enough. And as we watched the implementation, if you think of, the daily shortages went from 40 or 50 a day to 30 to 28 to pretty much got down to 1 to 0. After it probably took us about 6 months to get to that point. And we just had this constant, well, turn on the MRP. No, we're not going to run the MRP. Turn on the, no, we're going to, and we went to the Kanban and the shortages vanished. And after a while, they stopped fighting because they realized we had less inventory and everything was on time. Yeah. Well, that was my first real view into the insanity of MRP.
Yeah. Yeah. So Bill saying we just need to unplug the MRP. What was his role in the company? What do you remember? Like what sparked that that idea?
Well, Bill had come on as initially a consultant, and then he got hired into as a director of materials. So he was responsible for explaining the shortages and responsible for managing the supply chain and all that. And his team, and Bill had previous experience from other companies where he'd put in Kanban and turned off the MRP and had great success. So he goes, no, we just got to do it. And Bill's one of those guys who was, oh, shucks, oh, whatever, let's just go ahead. He didn't play the political games. He pretty much just called a spade and said, we need to do this. And he said, I know you guys don't like it. You think it's going to be a messed up thing, but guess what? You just need to be patient. And they weren't very patient. And, 3-4 months and they could see the back orders coming down, the noise, the noise or the frustrations from the sales force started to ease because we were filling orders better, we were reducing inventory. And then we had to start explaining to the CFO why inventory being lower was a good thing, because they always go, wait a minute, my balance sheet's starting to look funky. Yeah, but we're turning inventory into cash.
Yeah.
Well, that's not how we had these arguments and fights. And I'm glad I didn't personally have to fight it, but I got to see the benefit of the transformation. And I was actually building some of the graphs and tracking the inventory because my team were working on building the Kanbans and doing all the calculations and working with the warehouse team and setting it up. And we bought more acro bins than I can imagine, but it was such a small investment when we think of the benefit we got out of it.
Sure. So can you talk through a little bit? You've talked a little bit about scheduling, and we may have listeners who are not familiar with MRP. I'm kind of trying to jog my memory because it's been a long time. But one thing I recall is, the idea of, well, okay, for one, this would all work perfectly if the forecasts and supplier deliveries and everything had zero variation, like if they were accurate and what have you. So when you talk about part shortages, I remember one of the issues being, you would do this long-term planning and generate orders to the suppliers. And it wasn't one of the big problems that the supplier lead times were longer than the order and forecast horizons?
Yes, absolutely. And particularly in electronics industry, if you order any kind of circuit boards or printed circuit assemblies from Taiwan or China or other places where their costs are very effective, even going back, 20 some years, PCBA lead times or printed circuit lead times were often, 6 weeks to 6 months. And yet we were trying to plan out for 3 or 4 weeks, but we didn't know if the parts were going to be here or not until we eventually put the Kanban in place. One of the things that I think is particularly perplexing is there's a thing in MRP2, which is called the MPS, the Master Production Schedule. And to your point on the scheduling, you're scheduling out, in some cases you're doing more like a capital forecast and a production forecast, and you're looking out 6 quarters, so a year and a half. The MPS tends to get very, I'd say, unreliable when you move out past just a quarter or two. And to really forecast what your business is going to be like a year and a half from now is kind of tough. But if you think of long lead times for capital equipment and things like that, you have to do some kind of forward planning. But to expect it to be right on is kind of unrealistic. And it's funny, I was working with a med device company recently. They're talking about this master production schedule and how they were getting beat up because they were off by 1%. 6 quarters from now. And I'm like, well, what do you guys do? They go, we just fake it. I'm like, what do you mean you just fake it? Like, we fake it because we can't be that accurate. We don't know what's going to happen, but they yell at us if we don't have it right.
So do they but does faking it mean they revise the forecast to then make it seem like they were correct?
Make it be whatever it needs to be, because it's kind of a bit of a joke. You only need to be directionally correct. If you're going to buy capital equipment, you're going to lease or rent buildings and stuff, you have to have a longer planning horizon. But a lot of that is guesswork. And I think that's my biggest concern, is that we expect to be able to forecast the future. And in light of that, when you look at your schedule, wait a minute, lead times are not fixed. They do vary.
Right.
And usage is not fixed, and it does vary. And both of those calculations go into your Kanban equation. But we put a safety factor in there to buffer it for that normal variability. But that tends to work a lot better than guessing and buying to a guess to just find out, oh, yeah, you know, that order we were expecting for 4,000 of the Model A's, it didn't come through. Well, what are we going to do with all the material we bought for it? I don't know. We'll try to figure out how to. And it sits there, and no one wants to write off the stuff they built too much of, because it's a direct hit to the bottom line. So you're always in this battle between guessing and reality. And I just like to see people try to get away from that.
Right.
Somebody was telling me the other day, they were discussing, they had read the book, and they said, you know, when I look back and I think of how much we used to write off at my company and how much all companies must have to write off for bad forecasts, as an example. And I said, listen, I'm just going to look at the last 25 years. He said, I bet it's close to $1 trillion or more. And I'm like, you know, I said, I probably need to do the calculations, but you're probably right. It's not billions in inventory. It's probably trillions, because if you have a company that's let's say a $1 billion company, and they write off 25 million in inventory a year, that's a fairly decent percentage. But think of the global gross domestic product and take a small percentage, and then go for 30 years, and you start to get in trillions. And trillions is a lot of waste. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. It seems like there was that challenge to balance the risk of excess inventory against the risk of lost sales.
Yes.
Can you talk about sort of, you know, trying to balance that? And of course, lead time reduction. Quality improvement, that is, you know, kind of ultimately the answer to break the trade-off. But I mean, it seemed like at Kimberly Clark, I'm guessing those products were very stable. They didn't expire. There wasn't a lot of, you know, like the inventory holding cost might have been lower than it was in other businesses. 25 years ago, I was starting at Dell Computer, where very fast changing products and technologies, and they would say, only half jokingly, you know, electronics, PC components part inventory ages like milk sitting outside on a hot day. It's only declining in value. It's only becoming less, you know, there's less demand for it. So Dell wasn't quote unquote lean, but they were certainly trying to do a lot to reduce lead times and improve flow. And they had the leverage to force suppliers to take on some of that risk of like, we're going to make you hold it, and if we decide we want it, you can ship it down the road. But yeah, it's just interesting to think through all these different trade-offs of, as you touched on earlier, building what, you know, the order priority would be versus what can we build. Dell was still often in that situation, but, you know, they would run some basically material constrained MRP. Yeah. Like every 2 hours instead of once a week. But still, I mean, like, we're trying to get out of the situation of building what we can, and better yet would be building what we need, shipping when it's needed.
So one of the things I think is probably the most appropriate, and the main reason I wrote the book, is I was working with a large client who had the same kind of thing. They were trying to do quick deliveries. They were providing medical stuff into operating rooms. They needed to have stuff on hand. They couldn't not have it because of patient surgeries and so forth. And I did some research, and I covered it in the book in more detail. I did some research on MRP and its, you know, foundation, and where did it come from, and so forth. There's a group out there called Orlicki. Orlicki's foundation. They basically were I'd say the foremost authority on MRP and MRP2. They've written a number of books. They actually just published in January of this year, 2024, Lickies, and it's a 4th edition on how do you actually run MRP.
Yeah.
And when you read the book, and I found this almost, it was an epiphany, but it was almost a catastrophe at the same time, is they say the best way to manage inventory is with a min-max system using barcode scanning. And I had to read it 3 times. Because I'm like, wait a minute, these are the people who invented MRP. And I read further into the book, and Claire read the entire book, and they said, yeah, material requirements planning, not material requirements procurement or material requirements purchasing. It's planning. It's a planning function. We plan using the material requirements so we know capacities and so forth. But in terms of managing the inventory, because of the unreliability of the forecast, they say, no, you manage with the min-max, which min-max is essentially a Kanban, right?
Right.
And I read that, and I kind of was just dumbfounded. And so I read further into it in the most recent edition, and they say the same thing. It says, we've been telling people for years, don't buy with the forecast because it's going to be wrong. No matter how good you are, it's going to be wrong. So why do you keep buying with it? I'm thinking, wait a minute, the authority on MRP says don't run, MRP to buy stuff. And I just found it almost dumbfounding, but I went through and I said, okay, now I understand why. And I did more research and found out more information. And they said, yeah, you're not going to get it right. The planning side of it is for planning. It's planning purposes. It's not for buying. And they do discuss one thing, which is I think a lot of people are unaware of, and you may have heard of this or not, but there's a thing called demand-driven MRP. And essentially and you can go to the Demand-Driven Institute. They're all about how to make MRP work. So it's basically a marriage of MRP and min-max levels throughout the system. So you don't buy to the forecast. You just manage all your different inventory points as little supermarkets with min-max. And it's very sophisticated. I think it can bolt on or be an addition thing to Oracle, SAP, all the different groups that are out there. I think there's ways to do it. But it essentially gives you a way to do min-max management of all your inventory without buying to a guess.
Yeah.
And I ask people, I go, have you heard of demand-driven MRP? They go, no. I talk to people who've been in the industry you and I are in, lean and healthcare and manufacturing. Very few people have heard of it. And I'm thinking, why? And then I realized why, Mark. With my research, I found out, how much the software industry that supports buying MRP and MRP forecasting modules and AI-influenced derivatives, you know how big that market is in a year?
Billions?
$75 billion globally.
Yeah.
That's how much they're selling in software every year. Now, some of it's ERP systems, but still.
Well, and then there's the whole consultant ecosystem. No offense to consultants, I'm a consultant. Yeah. But I mean, there's a lot of people making money off of recommending and implementing.
Now you get it. And that's the frustration for me. And I ran into it pretty seriously with a commissary company that was supplying stuff, and they said, no, we're sticking with the MRP. I go, no, you guys need to go to Kanban. You're overflowing your warehouse with aisles that are so stuffed you have to unpack the aisle to get the stuff to load a truck and then put the stuff back in the aisle. That's how bad it is. Yeah. He's like, but no, we're going to get a new demand management module. It's going to use AI and it's going to have this forecasting. And I'm like putting my head in my hands going, no, that's not the answer. You guys are buying to a forecast that's inaccurate. Yeah. Well, we'll get better at the forecasting with this new software. And I'm like, no. And I just couldn't convince him.
But that's been the promise for at least the last 25 years of more sophisticated, getting better at MRP, fixing the MRP, improving the MRP. This battle between sophisticated versus simple. Yeah. Like simple doesn't sound impressive. Like, oh, these Kanban systems work. I'm like, yeah, but am I going to get promoted by implementing something simple? I mean, there's all kinds of different factors and dynamics there. People love or maybe have a bias towards sophisticated, right? And these vendors, we're more sophisticated.
You can just push a button and it does everything for you.
Yeah.
I remember we were working on we were turning off MRP and putting in Kanban into one of the facilities in South Dakota. And they were just really resistant. Like, I don't know, this doesn't sound right. I mean, we're going to bins and cards and laminated things. I mean, it sounds like we're going back in time. And I'm like, yeah, but you guys are suffering, because they had the situation, trailers in the parking lot. The kid even walk in and out of their aisles. And we said, we're going to make this change. We know it works, and just be patient. And I remember the materials manager going, really? I mean, this just doesn't sound right. And she was very skeptical. And then 6 months later, she goes, oh my gosh, I have my life back. I'm not here 7 days a week. I'm not constantly trying to explain why we don't have what we, need in place. And they were so concerned about Kanban. They used cards that were 8.5 by 11, pink, bright neon pink inside of a sleeve. But you know what? It worked for them. And if they found something, they knew it needed to go somewhere. And after a while, they're kind of going, we love Kanban. Oh my gosh, such a change. And I actually have several quotes from them that I've presented to other people, and they go, wow, I feel just like she did at the beginning. I don't buy into this. It doesn't make sense. And yet they get to the other side, and they just can't believe the change in their life. But I'm relieved to some extent, Mark, in that we don't have to do Kanban per se, like many companies have switched to Kanban directly. There is this alternative of demand-driven MRP, which does have sophistication and capability, but it basically takes that forecast element and goes, nope, and puts it off to the side and says, no, we're going to manage with min-max. And if you have something, so are you familiar with the idea of runners, repeaters, and strangers? Have you ever heard that before? It's like
long time ago, but sort of like your high volume, make it every day kind of products consistently. Runners, repeaters, and strangers.
Runners, repeaters, and strangers.
Yeah.
And ABC is another way. So picking on docks is your high volume stuff, is in your lowest travel path, and then things that are a little bit less common or a little further away from the dock, and then stuff that's really not common is really far away because you just don't go pick it that often. It works well in either case. But when we start putting the Kanban in place with the runners, the noise level drops off right away. And then when you get to the repeaters, now you've kind of covered, in many cases, 90 to 95% of your volume. And then those strangers, the ones you only do every once in a while, in many cases, you don't even put them on Kanban, maybe some of the raw materials, but you build them to order. You say, look, this is not a common item. We're happy to make it for you, but its lead time is 3 days, where everything else I can ship for you today. But if you really want that, it's going to be a longer lead time. I'm happy to make it for you, but we don't stock it because it's only ordered a couple times a year. Well, that's fine. So you can have the proliferation of part numbers, but I don't stock and manage everything that way. And when you kind of go to that system, which I think most people do to an extent, then you can cut your lead time. You can still have customer service, but then you're not burdening and put this huge, albatross around your neck that you're trying to carry with this massive amount of inventory. And that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book, is like, hey, there's a better way out there. Whether you go the demand-driven MRP or you go Kanban or some kind of min-max system, you got to get away from buying with forecast.
Yeah. So I want to dig into the book and hear the story behind the book. But, one other thought that comes to mind, I think is the distinction between supply chain planning and supply chain execution. And those of, you hear, I don't know if people still use the terminology MES, manufacturing execution systems, as opposed to, MRP or supply chain planning. I don't know what you found in research or you're talking to people over time. My understanding is that Toyota uses MRP for longer term planning, but then they don't use it to drive plant plans, material. So is that kind of a good example of, like, yes, you have to do some planning, but then you can execute based on more real-time information or shorter cycle?
Right. And we have a good example that's not far from us here in San Diego. I'm not too far from Tijuana, and Tecate, which is a neighboring community to Tijuana. They have a Toyota Tacoma factory where they make the Toyota Tacoma for most of the western part of North America. And in the Tacoma factory, they build basically a pickup truck about every 55 seconds. It rolls off the end of the line. And I remind my class when I teach, I go, what happens if you have a problem and, there's an issue with the Toyotas in about an hour? How many trucks do you have? About 60. And where do you put 60 pickup trucks, knowing the size? They go, oh, yeah. They start thinking, wow. Well, there's a funny thing. If you want to actually go down near the border and watch the trucks come across into the U.S., they've got these, about every 20 minutes, a truck comes across that has all the Tacomas on it. And there's, a silver one, a red one, a black one, a white one, whatever, all the different mix. And those are actually headed to a dealership. They're not going to a warehouse somewhere. They actually build to order for what the dealership wants or what their inventory ask is. So when they run this stuff at Toyota, they're building to a specific order in order. So they actually make them run off the line in the order they fill the truck up, which is, requires quick changeover and good manufacturing execution. But that long range planning is about, okay, where, how many people do we need at the factory? How many are we going to be building? What model will we be? What version and so forth? And they're looking at 20 or 30 years. Where's the next factory need to be built? That's where that long-term planning is important, and understanding cash flows and finances and all that. But they're not telling you the order of what to build and stuff past what's in the production control schedule, which is, inside of a month or two.
Yeah.
And we could see that back when they had the Fukushima plant and the earthquake and the tidal wave and the disruption to the supply chain. Toyota was impacted because they don't have weeks and weeks of stuff on the water and weeks of stuff here. Everything is coming in, just in time. And there's a reason for that because, gosh, how do you manage when you have, trailers full of tires or trailers full of seats? If you're not deploying them quickly, where do you put them?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the flip side where people feel this comfort in having warehouses full of material is, in a just-in-time supply chain or something closer to it, that supply chain can recover more quickly from some sort of catastrophe or underestimating demand. It's a more flexible supply chain. And you think, well, you could have a warehouse full of products, but what if there's an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane? Inventory can be damaged, and without a flexible supply chain, you would be in more trouble for a longer period.
I agree. And I think of the other side too. What if you have upside demand? So this question comes up a lot when I'm teaching. What if I normally, let's say I build 500, widgets a day, and I suddenly have demand for 6,000 widgets as an order? It's like, well, I would drain everything I have and still short the customer, and then I'd short everyone else until I could recover. And I say, that the biggest challenge you run into with very high demand spikes is Kanban really can't handle it, nor can MRP. Neither one can. Unless you have an infinite level of inventory, you have to go back to the customer and say, hey, I understand you want this amount. Could we negotiate the terms of maybe we'll ship you this amount every week for the next 8 weeks? Is that going to work? And oftentimes they say, well, I don't want to pay for the freight. Well, okay, is that why you placed a big order? Yeah, I was just going to cover my yearly purchase. All right, how about if we split the freight and we'll ship you XYZ? And they have to go, sure, sounds good. But if you don't go back to the customer and manage the demand, you're going to suffer in either case. And having excess inventory is just a lot of money invested that potentially has risk of obsolescence.
Yeah. And I read The Goal in college, 1994, when I was at General Motors. 1995, they put people through a class and had people read it and play with some computer simulation software. But there's this one point, I think was even a Goldratt point, of leveling out the orders. Instead of doing one big huge bulk order to maximize the freight per part per unit, or to get a volume discount, like, well, we know what you're going to buy over the year, we'll give you the discount, but let us send it to you in smaller intervals. That can be win-win, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Goldratt taught, remembering.
Yeah, there was a specific example where someone wanted 2,000 Model 12s in 2 weeks, and they said it'll take us 2 months to build it. And they said, could you take 500 a week for the next 4 weeks? And they said, sounds great. And they got the order, and that basically saved the plant, is what they said in the whole story, as well as I bought the video a number of years ago, and I show it to my students because it's about 45 minutes long, and they get all the concepts with that. But I like showing that one because a lot of times it sparks ideas for people. It definitely can be worthwhile. We had a similar example when I was at DJO. Cardinal Health was one of the bigger clients that we'd supply bracing and bracing products and different things to them. And they kept placing an entire truckload order, I want to say every 2 months, or maybe it was once a month. And we went up to Cardinal and talked to them at their facility in the Bay Area and said, hey, is there a reason that you keep ordering just a truckload at a time? Could we do maybe a less than truckload quantity every week? They go, the purchasing person said, no, I don't want to pay for the freight. And yet the warehouse person said, that would be amazing because I get this huge truckload and I can't get it unloaded because I'm so busy filling orders that it takes us almost a month and I'm paying the fee on the trailer being dropped there. And he said, it's actually costing us more to order the way it is, but the purchasing person doesn't see the inventory person's costs. Right. And so we said, we're just going to do a less than truckload shipment and we'll reduce the freight cost to you. We'll pick up half of it and we're going to do it, every week. And they go, the inventory guy in the warehouse goes, that's going to be amazing because I can always adjust my order and get just what I want. And the purchasing guy says, as long as I'm not paying extra freight. And we got a win-win, but we had to talk to him about it because the left hand and the right hand weren't, having a good discussion, and they realized they were wasting money unintentionally just on the view of trying to not waste money. They were wasting money.
Yeah. Well, that's a great story about the opportunity that comes from breaking down silos and understanding.
Yeah, we went there. Yeah, we went there, and the guy said, "No, guys, will you please stop shipping me a truckload at a time?" It's like, that's what you guys keep ordering, and it was just funny. You get into these things, you think that doesn't happen. That's like from a TV show or a movie. It's not real, is it? You're like, no, it's real.
Yeah, yeah. One other thing that came to mind from what you're talking about is it's a question of, the people that were trying to do more and more with software and algorithms, the thought of like, are there certain lean principles that are just missing? Because again, I'm kind of reminiscing to systems that we implemented 24 years ago at Dell. It was very driven off of, for what do we need to build? And they were trying to hit on time delivery, and they were wanting to ship orders as quickly as possible. There was generally a 5-day commitment they were trying to hit. And, it was material constrained, and it was really just based on what needed to be built with the flavor of what could be built. I recently went and had a chance to visit the Toyota Material Handling Factory in Indiana, where they were talking about their production sequence and kind of tightening up and locking in the schedule. But then like that production sequence had an input variable that I think Dell paid zero mind to, which is mixed model level load.
Yeah, Hijunka systems, exactly.
Hijunka system and leveling the flow of parts back to suppliers and the benefits that had of not stressing or bullwhip affecting the different suppliers. So, I mean, does MRP software ever take Hijunka into account? Is that a quote unquote new feature and sophistication?
I would say to be fair, I haven't seen it much. When I see Hijunka or Hijunka, depending on how you want to pronounce it, I usually see that with people who are in a Kanban and in a pull system. I don't typically see Hijunka as much in people running MRP because they expect the MRP to forecast the future perfectly, give them everything they need, and that's what they put out in their master production schedule each week. But I guess the best way for people to determine if they're doing the right thing from a software perspective, whether running MRP or not, is like if you have excessive inventory on hand, like you're in outside warehouses, you're bloated, you're expediting regularly to bring stuff in and potentially de-expediting to push stuff out. You probably have, and you have material shortages still, even with all that extra inventory, you have material shortages. You're not doing something right, whether it's the MRP you're running, if you're actually buying to guessing, or if you just have thrown up your hands and you're winging it. Those are the symptoms of something's not right. And it reminds me of a famous quote from Taiichi Ono, and who was one of the co-founders of the Toyota production system. He says, the more inventory a company has, the less likely it is they have what they need.
Right.
And you're like, wait a minute, that's paradoxical. That doesn't make sense. But that's the case. Is, and when you have so much inventory, you're swimming in it, you often don't have what you need to process. And honestly, I think, Mark, the direction I would recommend for companies who can't let go of technology is start thinking, go to the Demand Driven Institute website, and I think it's just demanddriveninstitute.org or something like that. Go there and just check it out and see if that's an opportunity, because at least you'd turn off the ridiculous ordering to forecasts. I mean, think about the weather. The weather, they call themselves the weather forecaster, and they call themselves forecasters. Actually, they call themselves meteorologists, which I still have to figure that part out. Yeah. But they have cray supercomputers being run somewhere that are predicting weather patterns with, billions of amounts of data. There's a European model that models hurricanes. There's a U.S. NASA model. I think it's a NOAA or something. They have these amazing computers, and yet the forecast is still only directionally correct depending on where you live.
Yeah.
And yet we don't have nearly that computing power, and we're trying to do that with 1,000, 10,000 SKUs. Mm-hmm. How is that even possible?
Yeah. Is it an easier job for the meteorologists in San Diego?
It is. It is. They just go, today it'll be sunny and mild. And that could be pretty much any day of the week. We do get some rain in the winter, but not much.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was up the road in LA, it seemed like the main challenge was trying to rush through 5 different sub-region forecasts within the Los Angeles area.
Yeah, we have
the inland, the downtown.
Yeah, we have an interesting gradient. Most of California and the big cities is like that. You have the ocean, the coast, slightly inland, and often you have the mountains. And if you get like here, we have a desert on the other side of the mountain. So we have five regions, and the desert will be 110, and at the coast it'll be 75. So it's a big variation.
Yeah. So let's talk about the book. I'm going to hold it up again.
Sure.
We're talking to Jerry Wright, the Insanity Trap, what your MRP consultant won't tell you. Like, what was the origin story for the book? I mean, it's a big undertaking. It's your first book. Is this something you've been thinking about? You've been thinking about the topic for a long time. Were you thinking about the book? Or how did that come to be?
It's funny. Karen Martin, Mike Ochterling, Katie Anderson, a bunch of people, Tracy O'Rourke, all other authors that you and I both know and have been friends with for a long time. They kept saying, you should probably write a book. I'm like, what am I going to write it about? I didn't know if I wanted to write about my experience at DJO, which was one of the recommendations. But I had a little bit of a taste of doing some writing. I actually helped Tony Manos and Chad Vincent with the Lean Handbook. Years and years ago, I think it was 2010, I did a couple of contributions for that. And I've written a lot. I've written articles and so forth. So writing for me wasn't the issue. It was just doing something I really felt passionate about that I wanted to do. Because as you know, it's an undertaking and it's not trivial. It takes a lot of time and you want it to be as close as you can to as perfect as possible. But I kind of felt from an altruistic standpoint that if I didn't really push hard in the year 2024 to get people to realize there's a better way, I was missing the opportunity to at least get that heard. Even if just a few people and a few companies can improve their supply chains and reduce their headaches, I wanted to solve that problem for some people. Hopefully there'd be a voice of reason that could say, hey, boss, we need to read this book, please, because we need to change our lives. And part of it came from my time. I worked at a company on a part-time basis because I was a close friend of the owner and the CEO. And he said, Jerry, I need you to come out. We need to turn this business around. And I saw these poor people, fantastic, wonderful people in Athens, Georgia, who were literally working from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., taking work home on the weekends, and we were still having shortages. And we had warehouses full of stuff that we didn't need. And I said, I'd like to go to Kanban. And the CEO goes, yeah, that sounds good. Let's go. Because he'd been through many, many times before. And I said, okay, guys, we're going to start going to Kanban. And I did full Kanban training. I went through it. And they go, I don't know if that's going to work. I'm like, well, we're just going to start in a couple areas and where we're hurting. And we did. We did a couple pilots and a few models. And I go, wow, that works great. Okay. I got them on board with those pilots, and they said, this is working great. And it took almost a year, Mark, so it wasn't a trivial consideration. But it took a year to get changed over to Kanban. But once they did, they kind of go, wow, I go home at 4:30. I come in at work at 7:30. I'm working a 9-hour day. I'm not on the phone constantly yelling at suppliers. Everything's here when I need it. And I can go play soccer, with my son, or I can go bake brownies, with my girl's brownie troop, or I can go hang out with my husband or my spouse and do something fun after work as opposed to working. I mean, literally, they were working close to 70 hours a week, and it was everybody because they were just pulling their hair out. And when I saw that transformation, because I got a chance to live through the entire thing from beginning to end with the company and see the benefits, I had one guy come up to me, and he was a senior guy. He was close to 70, and he was still working. He goes, I've been at this plant since 1953, And we've never had a day without a shortage, like some kind of outage or shortage. And this was all pretty much make to order stuff. Not hardly anything was make to stock. And he goes, this week we've had no shortages all week, and last week we only had one. And it's like, I never thought I'd see the day. And he didn't work in supply chain; he worked in quality assurance. But he had been there since he was like 19 years old. And he goes, and it used to be a Westinghouse transformer factory. And he goes, I've been here since 1953 when I was 19 years old, and there was always a problem. And now we don't have problems. I don't talk about shortages all the time and a deviation or whatever. He goes, it's amazing. And I go, well, but we made a commitment to get away from MRP and from guessing and so forth and make this change. And I just saw the transformation for the people's lives. And they went, this has got to be something. We got to get the word out and get everybody to start thinking differently, because it's not that hard. But the people selling you software don't really want you to go down that path. It's not sophisticated, but it works.
Yeah. And that employee, I'm sure, would have said it's not possible to have a day without shortages.
For him, it wasn't, right?
Yeah. I mean, fair enough. We'll do things a different way instead of trying to do the old way better. But I know in the book you talk about, the psychology of all of this. There might be psychology behind executives being afraid of change, the devil you know versus the devil you don't. But I'm thinking specifically of, let's say, the people whose job it is to be chasing down parts and being expediters. And like Adele, before we implemented some of the software, there was a lot of that. There's a lot of people whose job it was to chase down and expedite orders. And, people take pride in that because it was very necessary in the old system. They're working hard, they care. It's better to, in that case, it was better to have these hardworking, diligent expediters than to not. But then when either job responsibilities change or some of these job titles literally go away, there's this question of, I would hope, from lean principles that you retrain people to do work that might be less stressful or more interesting anyway. But people still feel a sense of loss of like, I'm an expediter, right? Can you share about kind of helping people through that?
Yeah, and we had the I call it the heroism. It's being the hero. You ride in on the white horse and save the day, but it should be unnecessary. We had a electrical engineer at one of the Kimberly Clark plants I worked at, and he would come in his pajamas in the middle of the night and fix the program or whatever and go back home, and everybody called him the hero. And I'm like, no, that's not what we want to do. You want to have everybody know how to fix it, have the electrician know how to fix it, not have to call the engineer in, because he's holding information close to the vest and creating this heroism of he's invaluable. But the reality is that's not the way to manage a business. And in the cases where we had expediters, we actually had expediter titles at JO Global, and we said, okay, expediters now become Kanban specialists, and they actually manage the inventory. And it's a lot more rewarding to manage inventory and have no shortage and be able to brag about how good your system is. We'd have people come in from other companies during AME tours and look at our Kanban system and go, can we copy this? Can we take photos? Sure, you can have whatever you want. And then these people who were heroes as expeditors are now heroes as Kanban owners, showing here's how I do it, here's how I manage it. And these are folks who are, typically hourly employees, warehouse level staff. And here they are showing other, executives, managers, VPs of how they manage a system with the simple cards, and they have no shortages. And they start to feel this sense of pride and ownership that I think is probably greater than the hero of the day expediting function.
Yeah. And, that's a tough mindset to get away from. I'm reminded of a book, Beyond Heroes. It's a healthcare book written by Kim Barnes. She was my guest talking about that a decade ago in episode 197. There's still a lot of, unfortunately necessary heroics in a hospital that are required every day until you can improve the system.
Yeah, and if you think of Toyota and what they do not want heroism. They want consistency. And I think Philip Crosby, who did the Quality Without Tears and Quality is Free, made the comment, if you want your production operation to be more like a theater production or a ballet where everything has a cue and there's a stand. And too many companies play hockey. They drop the puck and you're not sure what the outcome's going to be. It's entertaining,
Yeah.
but it's not the way I want to run my business. I want a theater production or a ballet for my business, and hockey should be a thing I go see, not how I play business. Because hockey, the outcome is uncertain, right?
Yeah.
And in a theater production, it's pretty much certain, or at least you're planning for it to be that way, right?
The hockey game, unlike say professional wrestling, is not scripted.
Correct, for sure.
Not only is the outcome determined, but how we get there, and that's part of the beauty of sports. So, with your book, Jerry, again, we're joined by Jerry Wright, author of The Insanity Trap. Who would you say are the target readers for this book, or who have you talked to? Like, what types of readers are getting the most out of it?
I think the folks who are in supply chain and having to manage the daily challenges are the target audience I would like to see read it. But honestly, it's also business owners and GMs and presidents and C-suite folks who are responsible for their business, because if they don't enable their team to be successful, there's going to be that risk of write-offs, excess inventory, all those challenges. So I'd say, GM, CEOs, CFOs in particular, COOs, and then people in supply chain and inventory management. Those are the ones that need to be looking at this.
Yeah. And then maybe one other thing to dig into before we wrap up is, what are you hearing about the promise, and sometimes marketing might be ahead of the curve of reality. The promise of AI in terms of fixing forecasts. I just did a Google search here. I'm not going to name names, but a big 3-letter famous computer company. AI infused demand forecasts. There's another company with examples of AI and ERP, better predict your costs, better forecast demand, AI and machine learning. There's a lot being talked about, written about, maybe even they're trying to sell it. Like, what's the landscape here in 2024?
The word AI shows up in a lot of things, making it sound like it's got more learning and capability. But to the best of my understanding, no algorithms are able to predict the future. So it's essentially electronic or futuristic snake oil still. And I would still recommend that trying to forecast the future is a guessing game. And no matter how good your technology is, it's still going to give you empty promises and cause problems until you disconnect the two. Forecast away. That's no problem for planning purposes, but don't buy with the forecast.
Well, great advice. That's a great way to wrap up. So again, the book by Jerry Wright is The Insanity Trap. The Insanity Trap. I got tripped up trying to say The Insanity Trap. I need to go slow to go fast here. The Insanity Trap. What your MRP consultant won't tell you. And I recognize as an author and publisher, the barcode. I'm like, okay, this was printed, it looks like, by Amazon in Columbia, South Carolina. In a world of print on demand, you no longer have to forecast how many books are you going to sell. Amazon can respond very quickly, and sometimes they hold a little inventory, but a book printed through Amazon will never show out of stock.
No, it just may be a longer lead time. I make a quick note too. I've been reading your book, The Mistakes That Make Us, Mark, and it's wonderful. Really like your writing style, and it's very insightful to think about how we can better accept and learn from our mistakes. I really am enjoying. I'm about halfway through at this point, so I hope to finish it over the next week.
All right. Oh, well, thank you. Maybe we can let's do a combined book giveaway.
Yeah, sounds good.
We do some sort of, we'll figure out, and I'll promote, we'll do a contest, a copy of The Insanity Trap and a copy of The Mistakes That Make Us, because maybe someone's got an MRP mistake story that they'd want to tell.
There's plenty. The target-rich environment.
You should host a podcast, Jerry.
Exactly. Thanks so much for having me, Mark. I do appreciate it. It's wonderful talking with you, and I look forward to seeing you at AME.
Yes. I hope everyone is there. So thanks. Okay, I'm going to hit end.